Greetings. I'm Ed Steinfeld, Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I'm so pleased to welcome you all today to this screening and webinar-based panel discussion of the really phenomenal documentary film, American Veteran. I just recommend it wholeheartedly. Let me just say a few words about why this film and the panel discussion surrounding it are so important and meaningful to me. First, on a personal note, while I never served in the armed forces and regret that, I'm the son of a combat veteran of the Second World War and the grandson of a veteran of the First World War. As I watched this film, I really felt that it so beautifully and poignantly illustrates the institution of military service and the sacrifices and experiences of those who serve. But not just that, it also illustrates the profound ramifications of those individuals' service for their families, their communities, and for the nation as a whole. That's true in the United States, and it's true in many other countries across the world. That leads to a second point, and a second reason why I'm just so delighted we're doing this event today and that you all are participating. I believe it's essential to educational excellence at Brown and essential to our understanding of many challenges we face as humans to have voices from the veteran community and voices of members of active duty members of the military, to have those voices represented on campus. I'm delighted that today's event is co-sponsored with the Brown University Veterans Alumni Council. The council engages Brown alumni and parents and community members really by providing support and facilitating connections to Brown University students who are veterans or who are participating in ROTC programs. On a similar note, I'm really thrilled that the moderator of today's panel discussion is Lieutenant Colonel TJ Shanks, who is a military fellow here at the Watson Institute. The presence of TJ and other fellows like him, it's so critical for our educational mission. Let me just mention by way of introduction that TJ is an active duty Air Force officer and a command pilot. He's flown more than 3,000 hours and 500 combat hours in the C-17 and C-21 aircraft, and he's participated in combat operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and East Africa. I'm also delighted that one of the speakers on today's panel will be Katie Yetter, Brown class of 22. Katie, who's a student and a veteran, is a senior studying cognitive neuroscience and sociology. She served in the United States Marine Corps for 5 years as an F-35B aircraft safety equipment mechanic. She's currently the president of the Student Veteran Society and works as the peer advisor for veteran education. That's the PAVE program. She's the program coordinator and team leader in the Office of Military Affiliated Students. And there's a third reason why I'm so happy about today's event. The 30-minute screening of American Veteran that I'll introduce in just a moment, and the discussion afterward, it's all part of the Watson Institute's JFK Jr. documentary film initiative. The initiative is built on the idea that while the Watson Institute largely focuses on the social sciences and brings social sciences perspectives to bear, I believe, and we believe, that there are many paths to truth, including through the arts. American Veteran, the documentary film, it's a stunning work of art. We're so fortunate today to have on our panel discussion Leah Williams, Brown class of 1999, who's the producer and director of the film. Leah's career has spanned hard news magazines, and documentary film. Her work has been recognized with Emmy, DuPont, Peabody, and NAACP Image Awards, including nominations in both news documentary and primetime categories. In 2020, she was honored as WGBH's Peter S. McGee Fellow, which is awarded to a mid-career filmmaker who has shown exceptional promise. And I'm also so happy to welcome Amanda Pollak to our panel. Amanda, who's a Brown EMBA class of 18, a class of 2018 graduate. She's the producer of the series. Amanda has been directing and producing acclaimed documentaries for over 2 decades, including over a dozen films for the national PBS series American Experience. I'm a huge fan. Most recently, she produced and co-directed The Great War, a 6-hour series on America's role in World War I. So what I'd like to do now is introduce to you all a 30-minute clip from American Veteran. And then after that clip is over, I'm going to turn the duties over to TJ. TJ will moderate the panel discussion. And for everybody in the audience, what you can do and what you should do is ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, or for those of you on YouTube, you can write comments, and we'll make sure that those questions make their way to the panel. And with that, let me turn it over to the film, American Veteran.
There's a very special sensation in an aircraft. You know when you have your hover bubble, if you will, and you know when you don't. And when you're in an aircraft the size of a CH-53 Delta, you definitely know when you're falling and not flying. After the helicopter hit the ground, I came to, and there's just chaos. I remember rolling my tongue around my mouth and there being nothing, grit. I couldn't breathe out of my nose. My leg was in an excruciating amount of pain. But I didn't realize the severity of it. I thought for sure I would get a few stitches and I'd go right back to it. And I think my first realization of you're going home was when my sergeant major and when my gunnery sergeant walked into this makeshift hospital in Camp Bastion, and they were both crying. They both just stood there and cried. And yeah, I knew it was over. I knew I was going home.
When I look at this photo, I'm proud of this person. She looked like she went through a lot. I'm still standing tall. I'm still looking sharp.
The goal of every veteran's service is the tour of duty. That is what we train for and are willing to die for. But our journey doesn't end when we come home, and the road back can be a long one. My name is Wes Studi, and I made that journey. At age 17, I enlisted in the National Guard. A few years later, I volunteered to go to Vietnam. For me, service was a way to test myself and confront the challenges of war. Today, I am an actor with a long Hollywood career. But when I got back in 1969, I couldn't imagine what path my life would take. Sometimes, leaving the military can mean asking lots of difficult questions about the country, about the wars we fight, about ourselves. Coming home has a way of changing your plans, of changing you.
When you fly out of Baghdad, they stuff you in an airplane. You're sitting in cargo nets with all your equipment, and it's dark, you can't see anything. You fly out at night, for obvious reasons, because it's harder to shoot you down at night. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the scariest moment of my life, because it's right at that moment where everything could go wrong, and everything you did, everything you just went through is all for naught. Oh my God, what if they shoot us out of the sky?
You don't believe that you're truly on that bird. My mind kept thinking about certain people that didn't make it or got seriously hurt over there. So that's how I flew all the way to Guam. Then when we went down for the landing, I was waiting to either have an accident or, some kind of destruction not to let me get across this pond.
I just wanted to be left alone. I was trying to make sense of the last 34 months, the last soldiers I saw in the hospital. What happened to them? How are they doing? Where are they? All those kinds of things. And, I'm surrounded by soldiers high-fiving each other and drinking and carrying on and, power to them. I didn't want any part of that. I just wanted to be left alone. I wanted to be quiet.
When that flight takes off, all I could think about was that first beer. I'm not gonna lie. I'm just sitting there, I'm thinking about how cold and refreshing that first beer is gonna taste. Part of you is thinking, when can I come back and finish this? But I was pretty actively trying to swallow that urge and just focus on that beer that I was gonna get.
My tour was up in April 1969. One day, I was in the jungle, and the next, I was stepping onto a plane in Saigon. I was totally on my own. But it wasn't always this way. American troops used to come home as a unit, and it could take weeks to get back to the States. During the slow trip from France, World War I veteran Will Judy wrote in his diary that, "We talk much of comradeship in the coming civilian life. Like mystics, we are conscious of an association that binds us into a passionate group, different to all others." Making the trip together gave those veterans time to process what they had experienced. After Vietnam, the military realized how important it was to go through this transition as a group. It's one of the reasons it's done this way today.
You have all these hundreds of Marines getting off these buses, and there's just this field full of family members. We're all in uniform, we all look exactly the same, and they're all trying to pick out who their son is. And you're trying to look through the crowd to find, your family, and you start to hear people shouting names, and you hear these reunions, and you just keep waiting for yours. My mom would see me because I'm tall. She'd pick me out, and then she just starts running and just like slamming people aside, like a linebacker coming through on a blitz. It was important for me, at least, to be strong. She was already scared enough. If I broke down, she would have realized that her fear was warranted. But if I played it cool, then maybe she would just let herself believe that the tour hadn't been that hard.
When the families found out I was coming back to Montana, we have a small airport, but it was like that whole place was full. And as soon as I stepped down, that's when the drums hit. The two gentlemen that met me, they were both Vietnam veterans, was my Uncle Alden and my Uncle Daniel. They put some red paint on me, and then they were gonna put the war bonnet on me, and I'm like, no, women, we can't. He goes, no, you're a warrior now. It was just good to see that. I didn't expect that kind of a welcoming. When I was going down the stairs, they were saying in my language that, we are very proud of her because of the fact that, she went into war. She came back to our people to be part of us again. And she's a different person. And they said, okay, now you have to start your journey back. And I couldn't figure out what he meant. And what it was I had to lead the people. They put their hand on my shoulder and everybody followed through. We just walked through the airport until the song was over. And they said, she's home now.
There was such a sense of relief landing on American soil. I hadn't quite realized that it would be so emotional to truly land back home and know that it was over.
Good morning, how are you? Well, welcome home.
I remember our flight landing at 5 o'clock in the morning on like a Tuesday. And so for the folks in Maine to come out and be, essentially the first ones of the American community to say, welcome home, making a gesture that wasn't empty, it wasn't a platitude, it wasn't, a bumper sticker. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna tear up. It was really meaningful.
Welcome to Bangor, dear.
When I came back, I had a great plan to stay compartmentalized for as long as possible. I had hoped to just simply close the door on my whole deployment experience and move on to the next chapter of life. And on that very first night home, I put my kids to bed. I helped them brush their teeth. I read them a story like I had always done, as if nothing were any different. And I think that was more of living into a wishful thinking of wanting nothing to be different, as opposed to beginning to understand that I was a truly different person. The grief, the loss, the joys of military life, I was unfamiliar with what it was going to mean and the ways that I would really be changed and not be able to go back to who I was before.
PTSD is a far more serious thing than I had thought, because I didn't know that I was afflicted by it that much. I know what it is now to suffer from PTSD. It was a horrific feeling. It never, ever goes away.
I can remember driving down the road, and one of the songs came on that had been played over there a lot. And all of a sudden, I had a flashback. And so I had to pull over. And I immediately called my psychologist at the VA, and I said, this is what's happened. He said, you might not want to listen to that station. And I said, you're right. I mean, I was so surprised, but it just triggered it.
When you've spent 12 years where your life is in danger, then at that point, every day you wake up, there's a possibility of it happening. I became a control freak. And what I mean by that is if I go into a restaurant, I know which table I'm gonna sit at and which chair, which I've got the best view of the restaurant. I know where all the exits are. I know if they've got security cameras. And so there's this hypervigilance that always happens. It's disproportionate. You're eating a meal with your family, but the reality is I wasn't present. I didn't have that relationship that I wanted to have with them. And so the way I coped with everything was keeping my brain just mentally bogged down to the point where I had no time to think about anything personal.
In Iraq, I was working for the 4-star, at that time, General George Casey, that literally owned that fight. Everything in Iraq and that supported Iraq was my territory. I certainly have memories of events and things that took place that are terribly disturbing. Sometimes, no matter how many ways you fix your mouth to say you did everything you knew how to do and you did it as fast as you knew how to do it, it still is sometimes difficult to reconcile the feeling that you didn't. Geez, if we'd left 5 minutes sooner, if we'd left 5 minutes later, what if, the what if, that's hard sometimes to be at peace with, if that makes sense.
For me, I thought of those who I knew were dead, and I felt so guilty, survivor's guilt, because there's no rhyme and reason for why I came home and they didn't. I deployed out of my hometown. I came back to my hometown. I go to my hometown VA, so they take good care of me. And yet I've been in a mental health hospital 3 times in 15 years.
In your imagination, you're just gonna get out of the military and you're gonna put up the white picket fence and live happily ever after. And unfortunately, things creep out of your past that sometimes make that difficult. We were coming out of Kuwait up to Iraq, and Iraqi Republican guards that were in basic SUVs hopped out, shot at us with AK-47s and ran off. At that point, we were given the order to take the vehicle out.
Rapid rate of fire, engage.
It wasn't until we got next to the vehicle that we realized what had happened. And it was a mother and a father and 2 kids. And to me, that was probably the one thing I'm still to this day trying to shake. I just couldn't wrap my mind around what I had done. I'm a good man. I would never hurt anybody intentionally. And so walking away from that incident and watching that whole thing unfold absolutely changed me, especially when I became a parent myself.
This is me when I was a baby. And this is my daddy. And he can fight at anyone that is bad.
During my 12 months in Vietnam, I saw some pretty intense combat, and the prospect of death was never far from my mind. It's like that for a lot of veterans who find themselves in the action, no matter what war or branch they were in. All of us have to carry the burden of what we witnessed and reconcile ourselves with what we did or didn't do.
When you train for so long and you expect to do certain things, when those things happen, it's a rush. It is a feeling that I miss. It's a feeling that I try to experience again, and I often find myself in very dangerous situations just to match that feeling. Getting blacked out drunk, having unprotected sex, doing drugs. I'm scared that I'm like killing myself. I'm scared that I'm dying because all I want to do is just like crazy.
When I came home, I felt like I was going crazy internally. I was really distant, and my kids sensed it. But then at the same time, I was really mean. I didn't want to show my frustrations or weakness in front of my mother and my children. So I moved up to the attic. There I could cry alone, I could get mad alone, I could drink alone, and they wouldn't see where, you know, I wasn't the same.
I can't tell you how many instances where they'd call me up and be like, oh, so-and-so got arrested for a DWI last night. You know? Years later, so-and-so's addicted to drugs. Somebody took their life. Individuals that haven't been in combat don't understand there's no quick fix.
At points you feel like the book is closed, your war is over, but then you realize like the war followed you home and you just can't get away from it, you know? You just can't escape it. I think the hardest part about being a veteran right now is the losses keep mounting. Clay Hunt and I had served together all 4 years. Clay was kind of my little brother. He was my partner in sniper school. The one thing in sniper school is you're never allowed to be farther than arm's length away from your partner, ever, at any point in time. And they drill this into you, this idea that you can only survive together. And then a couple years after we came back from our last tour, when Clay needed me most, I wasn't there, and he killed himself. And you'll have a lot of people tell you that there's nothing you could have done, it's not your fault. You know, I understand that those are rational thoughts, but, you know, I'm not gonna lie to myself. There's more I could have done. And, you know, some portion of Clay's death is on me. I wasn't arm's length.
Walking down the street, you know, people see my leg all the time and they'll assume, well, you know, you must have been in the military. Thank you for your service. And don't get me wrong, like, I think thank you for your service is great, but I don't think people understand why they're thanking people.
When someone says thank you for your service, I feel appreciative, but I feel that it only goes bumper sticker deep. People would say it just because it was a thing to do.
I know some veterans have difficulty with the thank you for your service comments. I don't understand why. I think it's a way of honoring the military. I think it's a way of showing respect for the sacrifices that military members and veterans have made for their country.
For me, thank you for your service feels very socially awkward. When you're thanking me, you don't actually know what you're thanking me for. I participated in a war where children died. Are you thanking me for that? I participated in a war that I have some moral questions about. Like, what is the part that you're thanking me for? Because I'm not sure the good parts can be parsed out from the bad parts. Like, they all come together in a package.
Back in 1864, a minister named E.B. Hillard set out to track down the surviving soldiers from the American Revolution. He found only 7 left. History lives only in the persons who created it, Hillard remarked. Men like Samuel Downing, Alexander Milliner, and 105-year-old Lemuel Cook, who had witnessed the British surrender at Yorktown. They were finally hailed as heroes, but for most of their lives, they have been largely overlooked.
I was so sick of people asking me if I was someone's girlfriend or someone's wife, and why did I care so much about veterans issues? I had one woman walk into a room, and she literally reached across me to thank the guy next to me for his service. Not that I want to be thanked for my service, but don't like reach over me and act like I'm not even there. And I was just like, I should have got this tattoo on my forehead.
I think society expects a veteran to be my father's age and to have like a really cool trucker cap that has some patches on it. You know, maybe like a VFW t-shirt is probably the guy that, you know, runs the 4th of July parade. I think people who don't look like they're veterans have sort of a double burden where it can already be, depending on your experience, is a difficult thing to talk about. But then you're also trying to prove it.
You know, Veterans Day comes around and people look at me and it doesn't scream Marine, it doesn't scream veteran, it doesn't scream Major General, it doesn't scream First Latina to make General, it doesn't scream anything. You know, it just screams little old lady trying to get her free donut at Krispy Kreme.
Shortly after I'd gotten back from my deployment, my husband and I were out to dinner with a couple of friends. One friend turned to the other friend and said, like, hey, did you know that, Annie just got back from this deployment? She was going out with the teams and doing the direct action missions. And the other friend sort of gestures towards me, but looks at, the first friend and kind of goes, she did that? And I wasn't really offended. I was more amused, but I was like, she's sitting right here and she can hear you. And yes, she did that. Like, not everybody has the crew cut and the clean shaven sort of stereotypical look.
Do I want to be seen as a veteran? The reason I'm having a hard time with that question is because I guess it's similar to asking a question about, do you want to be seen as a survivor? Right? I struggle to be a veteran, the person who was in an abusive relationship with a system that did not see me and did not value me. Before I joined the Army, I was 17 years old, living homeless with my best friend. And so the thing that I thought I needed more of was structure, discipline, and then having a place to call home. But I served from 2003 to 2008. And the policy during that entire period was don't ask, don't tell. By that time, I had fallen in love with my best friend. And so I had a double life. And it was in 2007 I got that phone call. I talked to my sergeant. I said, my friend has been shot. He said, if this is just a friend, like, I'm sorry, but we can't give you any time off. And it was then that I told him that this was my partner and that this was my fiance. And he went to go tell the commander. My commanding officer said, you should surrender your weapon and expect a dishonorable discharge. I lost the single most important person to me to police violence during a routine traffic stop. I wake up every day without him. I will wake up every day for the rest of my life without him. What I am the most regretful of is that I spent 5 years of my life chasing discipline and structure from a system that didn't give a damn about me. There were some pretty big reasons for me not to want a dishonorable discharge. You don't get any of the benefits that have been promised to you. College education, the GI Bill. But the most important reason that you don't want a dishonorable discharge is because you were not dishonorable in serving your country. That being queer and being honorable are two things that can exist together.
That was very, very powerful. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'll echo Dr. Steinfeld's kind words, kind introduction, and also welcome on behalf of myself, Dr. Steinfeld, and the entire Watson Institute and Brown. Welcome Amanda and Leah and Katie. We really appreciate having you here, having your voices heard, like we talked about, and sharing your thoughts on the panel today. Also want to welcome everybody joining us online. We appreciate it. We've got a great crowd of folks joining us online. Obviously, like Dr. Steinfeld said, we'll have a brief panel discussion, and then we'll get to probably the meat of it. We really want to hear what the folks in the audience. We'll have a Q&A session and engage and have a dialogue is the intent. So like Dr. Steinfeld said, I'll just reiterate, I think you can submit your questions, whether you're watching on Zoom, I think via the YouTube function, You should be able to submit questions as well. I'll be able to see the questions that you submit on Zoom, and once we get to the Q&A portion, I'll do my best to try and keep up with those and get your questions asked. So what we'll do, obviously this is a wonderful work, a powerful piece. As a kind of a semi-veteran, as an actively serving member of the military myself, I just want to express my personal gratitude to Leah and Amanda and the entire team. It's fantastic work that you put together here, and it's very much appreciated, I know, by the veteran community. So what I'll do is, Amanda, if it works, we'll start with you. Like I said, this is such a powerful work. And we're so thankful for, all of the work and diligence and care that went into it. And that much is obvious. But I understand this isn't your first time tackling, very challenging topics of combat and warfare. And like Dr. Steinfeld said, you co-directed the Great War, which was very focused on World War I. And I was curious if you could walk us through how your experience making the Great War, or even any of your other projects, influenced or inspired your work on American Veteran.
Yeah, well, first of all, just thanks for having us here today. It's really a pleasure, and it's great to have the series out and being seen by so many people. So we're thrilled to be here. And yes, the project that I had done right before this was a 6-hour series that looked at America's role in World War I. And the focus of that film was really partly to tell the story of the war, but for me, what was most interesting about it was looking at the way in which the war shaped America itself, and the decision to enter the war and the role that we played in the war kind of changed the way that the country saw itself. And Woodrow Wilson, really resisted at first entering World War I, but when he did, he started something called the Selective Service, and it had been an all-volunteer army before then, and it was the beginning of the draft, essentially, and he really saw military service as a way of creating a common cause for the country. And it was eye-opening for me to work on that series and to really see how much. I am not a veteran myself, and don't have personal experience with the military, but in that series, I really saw the way in which that experience of bringing people together with a common purpose really changed the way that the country related to itself. And I think that since World War I, we've gone through a really large evolution, and with the the ending of the draft and the fact that there's such a small percentage of our country serving in the military, I think something very fundamental has been lost in terms of the ways in which we all come together. And I think that, one of our major goals with this series was to bridge the divide between veterans and civilians. And we really wanted it to speak to veterans and to civilians, and to make it clear, what veterans are doing in all of our names, and so that we recognize how much we all have to step up and be part of these decisions when we go to war.
Absolutely. And, and I think, this series has done a wonderful job at kind of not just telling those stories, but also kind of, carrying that through, what that meant for America and the citizenry and the world. Speaking of tackling tough issues, Leah, we'll move to you. You've got such a wonderful, wide professional background as well. Like Dr. Steinfeld said, from news production to coordinating underwater dive shoots and working with Sesame Street, which is like a dream job for me. But you've also taken on some really challenging topics, like women's issues and stories of Black America. And I was curious if there were any parallels that you found between those stories and the ones we heard on American Veterans, and if there were, did you draw any inspiration from that work that helped you shape American Veteran?
Yeah, well, I've certainly had some challenging topics for sure that I've had to tackle in my career. But I feel the thing that that is sort of a parallel for American Veteran is that really I always try to amplify the voices that always don't get that microphone. So stories that you don't always get to hear about. Those are the things that really resonate with me. And that's what I always want to sort of bring to the fore, if you will, whether that's because they've been drowned out or if it's a sort of a David up against a Goliath, or maybe it's just a story that people don't know about because they haven't really been able to have access to it. So that's what I always am sort of looking to do. And I think all of the work that I do actually ends up informing my new project or sort of my next project. So I always try and figure out, from a directing or producing standpoint, sort of what worked in the interview chair or how I was organized or, how I tried to find people to be in a film. And so I think with American Veteran, one thing that I really was passionate about was trying to include certain perspectives and to be very intentional about that. Documentary filmmaking, people think it's such a creative endeavor, and it is on many fronts, but there also are a lot of spreadsheets, too many spreadsheets. And so, so I made a spreadsheet and I said, where can we find some of these perspectives? And, Coast Guard gets short shrift in so many, stories about, about war. And we wanted to make sure we had women Air Force service pilots included from World War II. And we wanted to make sure we had religious minorities and LGBTQ perspectives. So, it was just with a lot of intentionality that I was really trying to move forward. And if I just kind of can wrap that up to say that I feel like, as a director, I have a certain skill set, but I spent a lot of years also producing, which meant sort of making things happen, making someone's vision happen. And so, as my one good friend likes to say, hope is not a plan. And so I've always been trying to be like, okay, what's the plan here? How do we make this happen? And then obviously as a director, you have to be flexible enough to, to pivot, when things don't go according to plan. But it was really important to me to have different voices, to be very intentional about that. And, I'm just hoping that people feel representative, that many veterans feel represented in the series.
Absolutely, and you'll be glad to know that is a cardinal sin in the military planning world as well. Is if you avoid using the word hope at all costs, if it involves a plan. It's okay to hope, just don't plan on it. But and that's a fantastic point too. And speaking of amplifying voices, I can't wait to hear from Katie and get her thoughts. Obviously a lot of this particular episode was about transitions, about transitions home, transition into a different way of life, and transitions in some cases into different people. Katie, I've heard you talk very briefly before about your transition, which was kind of unusually rapid from your Marine Corps life, and I believe you were even overseas. I think you were in Japan, and within a matter of days, you were here in Little Rhodey as one of our outstanding students here at Brown. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what that transition was like for you and some of the things you experienced and felt, leaving the Corps. I know you never actually technically leave the Corps, but, transitioning into civilian life and here in the Brown community.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So I had about a month between transitioning out of the military, leaving Japan, and then starting at Brown. So it was a very, very rapid transition. And when I started at Brown, I believe there were 12 of us in the veteran population. So it was very small, very intimate, which, looking back on was honestly probably better for me because my shop, seat shop, as we call it was 12 people. So it almost felt like I was kind of continuing this small family tradition. But I will say that, my last few years in the military is when I really started to get it. I really started to understand my job and to get my qualifications and to really, really kind of fall in love with the Marines I had been working with and the job I was doing and Japan, which is my favorite place on earth. And so then I kind of started to come to the realization that, I'm leaving. I'm leaving this behind. And, when it hit me is when I saw my gunnery sergeant at the time, now Master Sergeant, and a couple of my Marines come to the airport and say goodbye. And that was it. That was the moment I knew that I was leaving. And so the whole flight home, I was crying so much. I didn't even know why I was crying anymore. and then I came to, to California and transitioned out and came back to Connecticut, my hometown, and then came to Providence. And it was quite the shock, definitely quite the shock. And, at that time, I was so uncertain of what I wanted to study and what I wanted to do. And there was a lot of unanswered questions for me. And in the military, you know when to wake up, you know what job you're doing, you know what to wear, right? I knew exactly how my hair had to be. I didn't have to worry about it. But now, I that wasn't the case. I can't show up in my coveralls or my camis at Brown, or I don't think that would be allowed. So there was a lot of additional thinking really that I had to do. And for a long time, that was very, very difficult. And there were many times where I felt that I was not good enough to be at Brown and I didn't belong here. And, the running joke in the office was everyone watch Katie, make sure she doesn't run away and join the Marine Corps again. But it was really, that was the whole, Marines have each other's backs. That was exactly what that was. And so I'm still here and I'm a senior now, which is so exciting. But I'm really here because of my fellow veterans that helped me along. And if it wasn't for them and Kimberly Millette, the director of the office, I don't think I would be here and be in school, because it's a lot easier to give up than it is to push forward. And so like many veterans, including myself, it is a very challenging transition, but we know that about each other. And so keeping that community and keeping that camaraderie is so important in helping that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And Katie, I definitely feel you. I'm approaching my 20th year in the Air Force. And this is the first time in approximately 23 years that I've worn civilian clothes every day. And it was the tyranny of choice was a little overwhelming, not just in what to wear, but what to pursue, who to talk to, what to research. And I do have to say, you and your leadership and really the veteran community at Brown is very inspiring. So, your work is not just inspiring, the young students, it's also inspiring, the old guys over here. I will hold forth that as a role model going forward as well. Talking about some of those, differing experiences, I was very interested. One of the things I absolutely loved about this piece is something that I found was very underrepresented in, kind of modern storytelling, representations in the movies and film and media, was kind of that, very brief discussion of PTSD. And I do have to say, Leah and Amanda, and to your team, it is absolutely commendable kind of how you discussed that. It was very nuanced. One of the things that drives me a little bonkers is that, there's kind of this, presumption that anyone who's a veteran is suffering from PTSD, and that any veteran who is suffering from PTSD is suffering in the same way, to the same severity, and along that wide gradient of symptoms and how everyone experiences that. We had Edie Meeks, who heard the song that just triggered a memory and had to pull over. So those very sudden onsets, and then we had Marcus Padel, who kind of had that constant ever underglow experience, and that's very similar to some of my PTSD experiences as well. Sitting know which table you're going to sit in, knowing where all the exits are. I still find myself avoiding crowds. I'm watching eyes, hands, and backpacks. But I just I thought that was really, really interesting to be able to illustrate that wide array. And I think that's something that a lot of veterans who are working through PTSD, in varying degrees, have to kind of work through some of those social aspects. So I can't understate how important seeing a piece like yours kind of working through that, and bringing to light some of the more nuanced pieces of PTSD in our veteran community is huge. So I'll actually pose this to Amanda. So I was curious if that nuance was intentional. I know Leah said there's a lot of spreadsheets, and I absolutely believe you. I was curious if that was a deliberate or intentional theme, or did that happen organically or kind of as the interviews progressed?
Yes. Well, we did nearly 50 interviews for the series, and the interviews often lasted about 4 hours long. So we collected an incredible amount of material. And the material about PTSD was overwhelming. I mean, I think that is the reality of it, is that there was a lot that came out of those interviews that touched on the trauma of what it is to serve, and to experience war. But we very much intentionally from the very start did not want this series to be all about trauma. I mean, I think there is an inclination to think of veterans and either think of the kind of heroism or the trauma, these kind of very extreme visions. And from the very start, we really, really wanted to break that apart and do something that would be nuanced and sort of reflect a multiplicity of experience. And so, Leah talks about the spreadsheets, and we had like the most ridiculous boards with these index cards of like color coded with all the different people we had and who they were and what wars they were in and when they served and what their backgrounds were, and then what the sort of essence of their experience was. And so we were constantly weighing like, who's going to tell this story and how are we going to give weight to this experience, which is obviously so important, and so needs to be talked about, but not do it in a sort of just very one-dimensional way. And so, that could not have been more intentional. I mean, it was literally like we lived and breathed that question as we were making the series.
And if I could just piggyback on that for a second. We had an incredible team of people. Jean Tempest was a writer and researcher for us. And, from the beginning, we had sort of, sort of an outline of what we thought some of the common themes were for each hour, and sort of went through that. But what really emerged from all the conversations with the veterans was all of this sort of, nuance about these kinds of wounds of war. And as Amanda said, we were just really incredibly deliberate to sort of track what everyone was saying, but really then to try to figure out how we could incorporate these different facets without overwhelming the audience, because that's the thing too, is that we did not want it to be so heavy, so overwhelming that you would lose sight of what was being said. So it was a constant, I would say, a constant sort of negotiation and renegotiation of what that would look like.
Well, I think it worked, because, like I said, it was wonderfully done. One of the other themes too that I was very interested to see you addressed was the thank you for your service. I won't say it's a controversy within the military, but it's definitely a point of discussion. And, to the point where I know in the military, we've, of course, we can't help but make an acronym, but the TYFYS, pops up all over the place as the thank you for your service. And, I know that was something that, I struggled with, again, like I said, over the last 20 years. I had the first few years to kind of, work through the awkwardness, I don't know what to do with my hands. Thank you. And I found it kind of evolved a little bit into, well, if you really, I appreciate that, but you should really thank my family. They're the ones doing a lot of the hard work. And I found, in the last part of my service here, hopefully not the last part, but in the later years of my service, depending how much time and leverage I have to lecture folks, I usually give hey, I appreciate that, but there are a lot of ways to serve. Apparently the electricity is one of them. Hey, you can serve your nation, you can serve, good by voting. Please vote, pay your taxes, be involved in local politics, but that doesn't always suffice, and that doesn't always feel adequate. And so, Katie, I'm interested in kind of your take, on the thank you for your service comments. What's been your journey in terms of responding to those?
Absolutely. So for myself, it was a very heartfelt response, and the first reaction that I would always have, or I do have, is that that is a way for someone to thank us for our service, even if they don't know exactly what it entailed. And that's what a lot of the veterans speak about in this documentary series. And, you know, for myself, the years that I joined, and I was with the F-35, so it was a new platform at the time, I wasn't involved in the Iraq and Afghanistan war like some of the fellow veterans that I had served with. And so for a while, I would hear that, and I didn't want to say you're welcome. I mean, I didn't know what to say because I felt as though I did not contribute to the potential that I had wanted to when I originally enlisted in the military. And so for a while, I had to think of a response. And I finally told myself that the best thing I can do is say thank you, that they're taking the time to thank me and to thank us. But I will say that, you know, my fear with the thank you for your service is that it's not a conversation starter, but is in fact a conversation ender. And I think society has accepted the thank you for your service as being, you know, politically correct to say to someone who, you know, has served. And I think instead it's about asking the story. You know, I always tell people that when you see a man or a woman in a diner with the old Marine Corps hat on or the Army veteran hat, you know, ask them their experience, ask them to share their story, because we all have such a unique and important story to share. And for a lot of us, that means so much more than having someone thank us for the service. And, you know, in addition to that, I think it's so important for individuals who feel thankful, truly, genuinely feel thankful, to find ways to help the veteran population and the veteran community. And, you know, I think a big part of that is to look at resources that are available. And we mentioned transitions being so difficult for all of veterans. You know, no matter how long you've served, you know, you can serve 20 years and you get out and you could become an academic professional or another professional, and it's not the same. It really just is not the same. And so everyone goes through this transition and has this anxiety and this fear of this unknown, and this unknown of whether we will be successful outside of the military. And so looking at ways that we can foster that, we can bridge the civil military divide by looking at what it is that veterans truly need during this transition means so much more and goes so beyond just the simple thank you for your service.
Absolutely, yeah. And like I said, it always depends on how much time I have to lecture them, but yeah, I absolutely agree. Is, hey, let's sit down, let's talk about things you can do, if you really, you know, feel that way. But again, you know, it's interesting, you know, and you even saw it just in this excerpt of, you know, they're kind of very strong emotions. Some people feel, hey, this is a bumper sticker, and like you said, this is a conversation stopper, you know, and some people say, hey, they're just trying to be kind and express themselves, you know, on an uncomfortable or awkward topic. So yeah, I agree with Katie. I tend not to disparage people who are, you know, going out of their way to try and say something kind. It's, you know, not usually it's not usually you know, badly intended. But I do think Katie's absolutely right. It's a good avenue for a discussion and for education and engagement. And I do appreciate, I think this work, American Veteran, helps do that as well. You know, start those conversations. I appreciate it. And so, you know, Leah, I did, you know, want to piggyback off of that a little bit. You know, obviously, you know, one of the things that I think makes this work so strong too throughout the series is, you know, it brings in, like you said, this wide array of generations of you know, veterans, and, you know, not just different campaigns and different wars. You know, one of the frightening byproducts of, you know, a 20-year campaign in Afghanistan and almost 20 in Iraq is, you know, you have multiple generations of veterans fighting the same or similar war, which is not something, you know, we've seen. I was curious, you know, as you saw production unfold and you saw these interviews from these different generations, I'm curious, and we do have quite a few great questions coming in from the Q&A folks that come close to this, and we will get to your questions. You know, did you kind of, you know, can you walk us through, how did you see those differing experiences and kind of that evolution of veterans' experiences through, you know, the multiple generations?
How did I see the different experiences through the generations? I mean, you know, what was, I think, sort of fascinating was that what so many people had in common across generations, right? Even though obviously there were differences. If I back up a second here, you know, and speaking a little bit to the differences, piggybacking off of a thank you for your service, you know, someone who served in Afghanistan has a different feeling about that from someone who came out of Vietnam, where there was, you know, where the thank you for your service was not happening, right? So that all of that sort of came out of what, you know, the reception, largely that came out of Vietnam. But there were so many commonalities, I would say, across the generations. And, you know, even our veterans themselves spoke to that. You know, Shoshana Johnson was a prisoner of war, you know, in Iraq, and you know, there were prisoner of war from World War II, and she's, you know, she can have a conversation with that person in a way that no two other people can have a conversation, right? And I feel just like there were so many kind of commonalities across time through experience, right? Even though, you know, the campaign was different, the war was different, the, you know, what was accepted in society, you know, at the time was different, but it's those experiences. I think it's the bonds that a lot of veterans had with one another. I think it's what they were forced to do at many times for themselves and for each other. And then what those consequences were that really is sort of a common thread across generations. So yeah, that's how I would sort of characterize that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and we kind of talked a little bit about kind of the different experiences, not just across generations, but also, like you said, depending on the campaign or experience, and really even just kind of the environment in which folks worked, you know, coming from wide, diverse backgrounds of military service. You know, Katie, I know, like Dr. Steinfeld said, you spent a lot of time in the Marine Corps as an F-35 safety equipment maintenance troop, which as an aviator myself, I will say on behalf of everyone who sat in an ejection seat, thank you. If no one said it recently, I've never had to, knock on wood yet, actually test all of your, no doubt, careful work, but we were happy you were there. But it was also interesting, you know, you're working with explosives, ejection seats, safety systems, and it was a very, you know, male-dominated community when you came in as a maintenance troop and eventually as a supervisor. And I was curious, can you talk a little bit through that experience, you know, what that was like entering that career field and becoming a supervisor in a pretty challenging environment?
Absolutely. And I will say, you know, we're the one shop that when we install our ejection seat, we hope we don't see if it works. So it's an interesting concept. Yes. So it's funny because when I was growing up, I have an older sister and, you know, I love her to death. But when I was a kid, I always wanted a brother. Oh, I don't know why. I just always wanted a brother. And I begged my parents, like, please give me a brother. And I make the joke now that I had 11 of them for a few years. And so, you know, when I first enlisted and when I found out that I would be a mechanic, I panicked because the most experience I had was holding the flashlight for my dad. And we all know how that goes. So it was, you know, this period of, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to do this, especially on an aircraft that someone flies and you know, and it was nerve wracking. And, you know, so frantically before boot camp, I'm having my dad quiz me on all the tools in his toolbox. And I'm trying to read up on all this aircraft knowledge. And, you know, and when I went through the schoolhouse, I did really well. And I studied as hard as I could, but of course hands-on is very different. But when I had gone to my first duty station in Yuma, Arizona, I also had a small work center there. But I will say that my peers, the other junior Marines that had gotten to the unit before I did, were very helpful for me. And, you know, I've always been more vocal. And so I would always say, I don't know what that is. Can you show me? Or can you show me what this tool is? I mean, you know, I was still feared. I felt the inside fear of like, oh my gosh, I'm a girl that doesn't know tools. And that was the stereotype that a lot of women in the maintenance department have. But I realized that I won't learn and I can't grow. I can't get better if I don't ask the question. And so, you know, especially for women service members, we do have to work harder. We do have to prove ourselves in a different way. And so I focused my energy on, learning as much as I could, but also teaching as much as I could. And I think that parallel is really what allowed me to become a supervisor and have the faith and trust in me that I could lead my work center and lead maintenance evolutions on a fighter aircraft. And so it was a very long battle, and there were a lot of tears shed of not knowing if I could do it, if I could be a supervisor and be in charge of men, or if I could look at an aircraft and watch maintenance be performed and sign it off and say that it was done safely. But I took a lot of the morals and ethics that I was taught as a child and brought that with me and combined it with the Marine Corps ethics that we learn. And that was, to do the job right and to make sure it's done right, because there's a life that's in our hands. And passing that on to my junior Marines and seeing one of my junior Marines run a maintenance meeting and say to the supervisors of maintenance control, like, we can't perform that maintenance evolution because it's not safe. That moment is when I knew I did it. That was the moment I realized that that's the one thing I wanted to do. And that was to not make everyone the best mechanic, or, not be the best supervisor, but more so to have those ethics and those morals be passed down, because I think that's where a lot of leaders fail. And so, when I had gotten in that position and I had Marines coming to me, then I realized that that's when I had made it. That was my moment. And I'm so grateful that I was able to get there. And, I think for other women, especially those in the maintenance field or in ground side, it is challenging. We wear the same uniform, we wear the same patch, we have the same rank, if not higher, but we still have this expectation that we're going to fail. And so that's something that I want to change. I want women to feel powerful. I mean, we have this uniform and we represent the American flag, we represent the American people, and we get to serve alongside with others that we know will have our backs. And so using that as kind of fuel for the fire and using that as, I'm going to prove every single male in this field that I can be better than them, is the mentality that I developed. And it actually worked out in my favor, because I made the best of friends and the best family. And, every Marine Corps birthday, I still get the happy birthday Marine, which makes my heart happy every year. So, and it became a long lasting family and a long lasting friendship. And not everyone has that, but I will say that I was very grateful to have that.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. I mean, obviously the military community and their families face so many challenges. But I always say there's one thing that the military community gets that very few other groups get, and it's that sense of togetherness, that sense of camaraderie. It's tough pulling your family up by the roots and moving them around the world, around the country. But we know as soon as we get there, there's kind of this ready-made group of folks ready to support you. And that means so much, whether it's your team or the other families. And kind of along those lines, Amanda, I was curious, and I'm sure Leah's probably got some of these stories as well, working through, these interviews. You kind of already alluded to this a little bit, but I can't help but feeling, especially, there was certain degree of therapy happening through some of these interviews as well. Very briefly, and we'll wrap up the panel here in just a little bit, but I was curious if you could talk a little bit through, did you at any point start to feel like you were, 30% production director and maybe 70% therapist, and kind of did this work affect you personally as you were working through these interviews?
That's actually a question you should be asking Leah, because she was the one conducting the majority of the interviews, and I know what she's going to say, but go for it.
No, it was an incredible experience. It was definitely an honor. And contrary to what my friends may say, I am no way qualified to work as a therapist. Please, no one should come to me in that capacity. But where I will say is where the director hat really sort of overlaps is really just the ability to listen and to make people feel comfortable enough to open up. And I'll be honest, there were some veterans that were highly skeptical, and rightfully so, of of speaking to us and being vulnerable. One veteran in particular, Jeff Mellinger, who was a command sergeant major and had a 39-year career in the service, he was waiting for me. We had, initial phone calls before we sat down in front of the camera, and he was waiting for me to ask the question, have you ever killed anyone? So that he could end the conversation. Because he was like, you asked that question and I'm out of here. We don't need to go any further. I never asked that question. And we had a 3-hour initial phone call. And he graciously said, you know what, I'll sit down and I'll speak to you. And we had a 4-hour conversation on camera. It's really, it's a privilege to be able to have people tell you things they didn't tell their spouses, they haven't told their children. And I think one of the things is that what I try to bring across was that I just want to hear what you have to say. And I want to get this perspective from as many people as I can. I'm not coming in with a massive overall agenda, other than I want as many veterans to tell their story, and I want you to feel comfortable enough to do that. So.
And I would just add to that, I mean, Katie, what you were talking about and sort of the counter to thank you for your service is tell me your story. And I feel like that is so much what we heard again and again, and sort of what we saw in the stories that we heard from people is that so much of the healing, so much of like the productive movement of people's lives was coming through storytelling and coming through sharing their stories and being part of a community. And so that's, I think like sitting down was a catharsis, and hopefully that kind of translates to something that can be powerful through the series.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's clearly a lot of power in having time to look back and reflect on your experiences and your thoughts. I think kind of to wrap the panel portion before we get to the Q&A, I'm actually speaking of that kind of that catharsis and that digesting that time. So Katie, now you've had some significant time and significant experiences. We call it the air gap between your service in the Corps and now about to opened another chapter as a Brown student, and soon to be another chapter as a professional. And I'm curious if you could kind of talk about have you had any thoughts or perspectives since you left the Corps, and I think it was 2018. How that time in the Corps has affected you in terms of you as a student, as a professional, or even just as a human being.
Absolutely. I would say I'll start by saying that the Marine Corps definitely made me more resilient. So that's definitely been a trait that I will give that to the Marine Corps. But I think my time in service was there of course were up and downs, but there was a sense of purpose. There was a sense of duty, and we all felt it. And that allowed me to see the good in the bad. And of course, sir, this, and every Marine knows this for sure too, but that you kind of always expect the worst, right? So when something slightly better happens, it's great news. And that's so true, but there really is humor in that, because translating it to the civilian sector and in a professional environment, that's exactly kind of what I've trained to do is I make my plan and I try to find my sense of purpose, because that's where that gap is for a lot of transitioning veterans. And so having my purpose be a student and, expecting to graduate, but then getting honors as a plus, or, applying to grad school and getting in as a plus. And so treating everything as being goal oriented, but allowing myself to appreciate my accomplishments and to be excited when something really good happens, I'll definitely say is from my time in service. And, the looking out for one another, is definitely something that resonates in me as well. And that comes from, I got your six, which I got your back, never leave a Marine behind. You know, all of those things that we always say to each other really does stay with me and with a lot of the veterans that I know too here at Brown. And so the idea that, you know, you always have a team to rely on, and having that team mentality is something that a lot of individuals don't understand if they've never been in the military. And so they find it to be rather difficult to work with others in a professional and in an academic environment. But for us, you know, that's what we know. And so it allows us to mesh in with the population and other communities so much more. And I think a little bit easier than those that may not have served. And so, you know, I take those lessons with me, and I remind myself all the time of them. And I use the struggles that I've overcome to also remind myself that there's always that light at the end of the tunnel. And you know, you'll always have a sense of purpose if you know that you're doing the right thing and you're exactly where you want to be. And I think just reminding myself of that and reminding others is exactly what we do, you know, at 2 a.m. on night crew in our shop in the Marine Corps, but is also something we do here in the academic world.
Absolutely. Well, it's definitely served you well as you're getting ready to graduate and finish that thesis. So I'd like to transition now to the kind of the Q&A portion. Like I said, there have been some amazing questions coming in. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. I'll try and get to as many as we can in the time that we have left. I thought one that was very interesting. So John Kelsey wrote, you know, all of these men and women who were depicted in this episode were in combat. He says he spent 3 years in the Army during Vietnam, but didn't leave the United States, not by choice. And you know, when I hear "thank you for your service," I feel less than. And he says he usually says he believes in the war, enlisted into OCS because of his father and grandfather had been officers in World War I, World War II, but didn't go to Vietnam, and was curious how do combat veterans feel about the folks who didn't do a tour. And so I'll start off with this one if that works. And you know, John, that's a great question, and that's something that I think is still present in the military today. You know, there are a lot of folks who have served who have not gone overseas into a combat situation. There are a lot of folks who did deploy into like a combat support zone, but maybe not necessarily never into a combat zone. And there are a lot of folks who went into the combat zone and, you know, never left the wire and, you know, had a fairly peaceful deployment. And I think, you know, my personal perspective, you know, again, having been in this business just in the last 20 years, you know, I think there's a growing appreciation for everyone who wasn't a part of that, who wasn't, you know, you didn't have to be engaged, you know, directly by the enemy to get a sense that you were a part of, you know, the mission and part of, you know, getting it done. I think, you know, it is still challenging because I do genuinely think that there's a, you know, group of folks, particularly in some of the, you know, the career fields that, you know, generally see a lot of combat. You know, there's kind of a, oh, let me see, you know, do you have your combat badge or not? You know, there's a lot of kind of comparison, and I suspect now that, you know, the operations in Afghanistan have wrapped up. I do expect that there's probably going to be a little bit more of a comparison in terms of, you know, what are you talking about, Junior? You never been shot at. And I think probably every generation that, you know, that experiences that will probably have something similar. But I do think there's something, you know, of the last 20 years of operations have given the active duty components at least a lot of appreciation for, you know, those support elements that, you know, that kept them going, whether they were, you know, on combat support outside the theater or whether they were back in the States. I do generally think there's an undercurrent of appreciation there, but I definitely think it's worthy of conversation and making sure that folks have those tough talks that, hey, people contribute in all kinds of ways. And it's very similar to, I generally get very uncomfortable with, you know, kind of the aggrandizement of military service. You know, like I said, there are a lot of ways to serve and not everybody is outside the wire. Leah, did you have a follow-on for that?
I just wanted to say that in the series, I mean, yes, in the clips that we showed, definitely the focus was on combat related trauma, if you will, and other roles. But the entire 4 hours actually encompasses people who were not in combat, and we talk about some of their transitions, like Katie was mentioning, you know, when you're leaving the service and just what that sort of disorientation is, because, you know, you're not getting your check on the 15th of every month, and you're not going to the PX, and you're not, you know, I mean, just those things, and how that can be, you know, somewhat of a transition. Or people who were photojournalists and, you know, in the Marine Corps, or, you know, just so many roles, really. And so we do speak to that within the series, because we didn't want this to be, you know, just to be about those who were in combat. You know, most people aren't. Most who serve aren't. So.
And so Scott Quigley had a great question as well, talking about, you know, his time in Joint Special Operations Command, working with the U.S. military, other government agencies in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He was very privileged to have been a part of that. And, you know, it's interesting, he says he was looking back on his service and very positive feelings as a whole. You know, and talking about that manifestation, the PTSD, and we heard that a little bit in some of the interviews in terms of the, you know, missing the adrenaline, kind of not necessarily even just kind of that adrenaline of, you know, direct engagement combat, but even just, you know, like a couple of folks said, being able to do what you've been training to do is a remarkable experience. And through, you know, this episode and several of the others, I'm curious if you saw an undercurrent of that. I expect that's probably one of those themes that bridged a few generations. And I'm curious to see, obviously I've had a lot of exposure with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. You know, Leah or Amanda, did you see that with the other veterans from kind of other theaters?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think really across the board, something that people talked about pretty consistently was that sense of purpose. And I feel like I'm hearing it from you, Katie, as well. Like, I don't think it just has to be about combat or being in a war. Actually, I think it's being part of a community with a real sense of purpose. And we definitely heard it again and again. I mean, I think the oldest veteran that we interviewed, a guy named Edward Field, who flew in World War II, and he talks about the excitement of it and just like what a thrill it was to be doing what he was doing, and how he kind of couldn't walk away from it. So I think that was just very much of a consistent thread.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of along similar lines, you know, Scott Quigley, you know, writes as well, talking about, you know, finding that other folks on his teams really struggled with this concept of, you know, loving their time in service and feeling like they were part of something. And that's something that, you know, I struggle with as well, even today. You know, I'm married, I've got two little girls, and, you know, I go and I put them to bed, and kind of struggling with that guilt of the kind of ever tugging desire of, I want to go back. I want to keep working. You know, I want to keep doing this. You know, and a couple of folks like, yes, on the way back, you're thinking, man, that beer is going to taste nice. But there's kind of always that lingering piece of, you know, send me back. There's more work to do. And so I think Scott's point is very interesting, that, you know, that's what he's seen, is that a lot of folks who've experienced that, and not even just combat, even just service, that, you know, they feel this ever-present guilt of wanting to leave this, you know, this remarkable place that they have, and wanting to go back to be part of that team or part of that mission. I guess, you know, this is a good one for Katie. You know, do you kind of feel that nagging pull? I know you kind of joked about make sure Katie didn't go re-enlist, but you know, how do you channel that energy or that feeling, or even guilt if you've got it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I do have that feeling. And I think a lot of it does stem from this feeling that I didn't accomplish everything that I wanted to while I was in the military. And, you know, when I first enlisted, I had originally in my mind had decided that I wanted to be a pilot at some point, but wanted to have enlisted experience first. And yes, exactly. It just so happened to be that I was an aircraft mechanic, so it worked out kind of perfectly, I guess. But I have that in my head still to this day. I'm always looking at the age requirement, like, okay, I have 6 years, I have 4 years, and I do always think about it every day. And I think for me, what I have to remember is that, the service that I did was what I needed to do at that time and contributed at that time. And so reminding myself that I did accomplish what I needed to accomplish and that I'm accomplishing what I need to accomplish now in my professional life is what's keeping me on track. And knowing that the military is there and that I have the option to go back to it. But first I need to work on myself. I need to get my degree. I need to get the experience that I need. And I want to be 110% sure that my next career move is exactly what I want it to be. And it's not running away from something. My dad always says, run towards something, never away from something. And so I remind myself of that if, I do have this urge to go back in, but that's why I try and help veterans now. And my thesis project looking at helping formerly incarcerated veterans is something that I want to do now to help and to continue serving. And so it's a battle. I mean, every day it's a constant struggle of running to the recruiter or, going back and doing my homework. But just this idea that I know that I'm in the right place and the military will be there, and to focus on myself and to get through what I'm doing now is just a reminder that, we all have to do to know that we're in the right place and doing what we're supposed to be doing.
And if I can just say one quick thing is that, when we, and talking about the idea of purpose and sort of mission, the fourth episode and final episode really focuses on people finding essentially a new mission or a new way to serve, right? And that can be from something like local politics, could be through service organizations, starting their own sort of organizations and disaster relief. I mean, it runs the gamut. One veteran started helping other veterans by helping them tell their stories and doing writing workshops. So, I mean, there are 1,000,001 ways to basically serve in other contexts. And what we found was that a lot of veterans wanted to do that and wanted to create new missions for themselves, if you will. So that was something that was just really wonderful for us to document.
That's fantastic. And unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time. I think we've got time for one more question. There's a huge, awesome list of questions for folks. So I apologize if we didn't get to you, but so I thought this is a great way to wrap it up. So Anthony Uwe writes, he found the series so moving. Question for Leah and Amanda: is there one story? I think we got time to do one for each of you. One story that really impacted you and will stay with you throughout the series.
It's like asking us to choose between children. I mean, come on.
We won't tell the others, I promise.
Yeah.
God.
I mean, I was I'm going to cop out a little bit because I'm not going to name one person, but I will just say that I was really profoundly affected by talking to all of these people in the way in which it just gave me an understanding of what service means to people. And it really made me feel like we need something that engages everybody in some sort of project, like whether it's military service or just some sort of service to our country that unites people. Because really across the board, every single person that we spoke to, whether they ultimately had a positive experience, or many people we did talk to who had really profoundly challenging experiences with the military, but nonetheless, like, this was an experience that made them who they are and affected the way in which they engage with the world around them. And I hear it from you, Katie, like it just feels totally universal. And so that really touched me.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to cop out as well and echo Amanda here. I mean, I think really what I got from everyone was that, we all rise and fall based on based on what we do with each other, the responsibility we have to each other as citizens, really. And that's an ethos I feel like that was, really clear in terms of military, in terms of bonds. And I would like that to be, translated to all citizens, right? To have this understanding of not just what we're asking military or active military to do, or how we participate in the democratic process, making our opinions known, but also how we care for veterans, when they do return and when they do come back. And it's really my hope that we can all recognize this responsibility we have to one another, not as just citizens of the country, but really citizens of the world. So that's what I got from our veterans.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and that's a perfect note to kind of wrap the panel today. Again, I apologize for everyone in the Q&A. You had great questions. Obviously, I think we could all talk about this all night, but I know everyone probably needs to go get supper at some point. Leah, Amanda, and Katie, thank you so much for being here. Huge thanks to the Watson Institute and Dr. Steinfeld and Ellen White and the whole team for putting this together. This is fantastic. For those of you who haven't gotten the chance to go to PBS, go watch this series. It is absolutely fantastic. Veteran or not, I think everybody benefits from having seen it. I know I did. So thank you, all of our panelists. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. Have a wonderful, safe evening, and hopefully we'll talk together again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.